talking about the very expensive, large chiller plant, constructions that in some situations make sense and are the most efficient ways to do things, but ways in which we might be able to attack this differently. So again, we're looking at that. I think to better answer your question, though, if that appropriation does come through, then I think we definitely owe you a detailed breakdown of exactly where we're going to put that money and how we're planning on spending it to abate the heat.
Okay, and the last question: would the department consider petitioning the PUC to remove the restrictions on placement of the restrictions on limiting the size of PV systems at the schools?
Right. The department doesn't have, my understanding is, the ability to actually represent at the PUC. We have engaged a lot of our partners that do have that ability and explained to them our situation to make them aware of it.
But the department would be supportive of that, though.
Yes.
Thank you, Brian. Lance?
Brian, maybe I can shed some color on that. I did meet or facilitate a meeting with some representatives from HECO, along with Dan and the superintendent, to talk about ways for them to collaborate and work better together to work towards getting a PUC approval towards the time of use issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Any other questions? Seeing none, we will move on. Before we move on to action items on our agenda, I'd like to just once again check if there's any additional public testimony.
Not at this time, Chair.
Thank you very much, Gina.
You're welcome.
Okay, under action items, first we have action scheduled on restriction implementation on the department's 2015-2016 fiscal year budget. Amy Kunz, Senior Assistant Superintendent and Chief Financial Officer, will provide a presentation on this topic.
Thank you, Chair, members of the FIC committee. So if you recall, last month I gave an update on where we were with the restriction, and kind of we were in a period of not knowing all of the information. So I think about a week or so after that, we did get a memo from the governor about the annual restriction implementation. Through that process, if you recall, we had initially received a quarterly allocation. So in order to fulfill and get the annual allocation, because if you recall, we pushed out all of the funding to our programs for efficiency purposes for the full year, even though we only got a quarter less restrictions from BNF. So in order to make sure that we weren't bouncing checks, we completed a preliminary BNF numbers to get our allocation for the full year, with information from them that it needed to go through board for approval. So what we did for BNF was just provided some numbers that were straight reductions across the board, and what we're presenting to the board today is more of a surgical recommendation on how to implement the reductions that we're targeted with. So total restriction for the department is almost $15 million, so $14.7 million. Of note is weighted student formula is on that list. However, we have allocated 100% of weighted student formula based on enrollment and as principals had planned for that last year. The amount on this restriction is a reserve amount that we keep aside for any enrollment increases assumed at the first enrollment count, which is I think 10 days after school starts. We still maintain a reserve for any enrollment increases that happen in the October and January counts, so we are covered there. And we actually put in our memo here, if there are any parts of the $14.7 million that is released from the restriction, we have prioritized that on the very bottom of our memo We would restore those funds, starting with WSF, our complex area, so our CASs they would be restored. School transformation auxiliary services, because they are doing a lot of this work around the AC and heat abatement issues now, and information technology programs. So we have already stated if we get a restoration of these cuts, where we would implement those. So in the spreadsheet there is a list of how we came up with the reductions. Again, the target is just over $14.7 million. We're using some carryover and COFA money to reduce what the assistant superintendents and the deputy had to find to $9.9 million. And you can see the list of reductions there. I will say that this was slightly surgical in that we gave assistant superintendents and the deputy and the superintendent actually targets on reductions to make within their areas. And then each AS went in to review their budgets to determine if they accepted the targets that we gave or wanted to change accordingly. So that is the detailed list that's attached to the memo. Any questions?
Brian, please.
The enterprise, not enterprise, but the integrated special education database, what is that?
Sorry, I don't know if I know that.
You're deleting the whole thing.
That's in the OSA section.
Yeah.
The second item in the OSA section, it's an older IT
Sorry, this is Brian Hallett. He's my budget director.
It's an older IT system, and this would be the second year that the full amount would be restricted. It's something that's outdated and not required. These funds are not required for the system.
So in other words, we didn't use it last year, we're not planning to use it this year. Why we went to the legislature and asked for the money then?
This is a program that was previously funded on a recurring basis.
Did we get when in terms of our supplemental appropriation for utilities, did we not get $4 million more than what we had requested as a department?
So the amount that the board and the department requested differed by $4 million from what the governor passed through his budget.
Mm-hmm.
So the legislature appropriated what the department and the board approved as the request. The governor had reduced that amount by $4 million.
Okay, so in terms of the restrictions, why don't we just keep the weighted student formula money of $3,722,856 and reduce the utility, restrict the utility budget by that amount?
I think and we're monitoring the situation, but with all of the extreme heat right now and with what we're doing on the short-term measures and trying to get relief into these classrooms and the fans and the portable ACs that we're plugging in, I do not feel at this time that we should be restricting the utilities budget. When we went through the process and defined the need of our utilities budget, our request and what the board had approved was around $13 million. And we justify and we do need that level of funds.
Are there vacant positions that are budgeted, that are presently vacant?
We
in
have,
EDN 200 and 300. In other words, positions that are vacant at the present time that have been funded.
yes, there's just a little bigger piece of that puzzle is we have vacancies already accounted for as part of our total budget. So that's an offset to the positions that we have budgeted. So we have positions budgeted and then there's a large negative amount for assumed vacancy savings. But yes, there are positions that would be budgeted that are vacant.
In other words, we plan to fill them, but we have not filled them. So you have not counted them within your employment savings, right?
Correct. But there's a certain level that's already budgeted that we assume will be vacant. It's just not specific positions.
Right. So what I'm trying to inquire is, in EDN 200 and 300, what is the dollar amount? If we restricted the filling of those positions, what would be the dollar amount savings?
I'd have to get back to you on that.
Well, we have a GBM meeting at 1:30. Will you be able to get back to us before 1:30?
I'm not sure that we can do that. We can make an effort.
Would it be easier to balance the weighted student formula by restricting utilities for now? And then you can provide us that information at a later time? In other words, there may be a desire not to restrict weighted student formula at all. I understand your logic, but at the same time, to provide more monies to the school, even as a reserve, if they can be assured that that would be done, we may want to restrict something else other than utilities. But more importantly, we would like to understand what positions are at EDN 200 and 300 that are still vacant, that are planned to be filled, that we could restrict.
We can try to work on something. If it comes up later in GBM, we can.
Patricia.
Thank you. I have a couple questions about the EDN 100, some of the ones that you're considering restricting. So for the Malama Learning Center, 100% is restricted due to AG decision. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
So that's a grant and aid, and it was determined through the process of I don't know that I can speak to the AG opinion.
Our grant and aid process requires that we go to the AG and that they review them to make sure that they conform with Chapter 42F. What they found in this case is that it appears to be in conflict with Article 10 of the Constitution, and it's a private or secular educational institution. Non-secular educational institution. This is very similar to the issue around privatizing preschool. It's the same section of the Constitution that they found conflict with, that we're using state funds, or would be using state funds for that purpose that's prohibited by Constitution.
So because of that reason, we're saying that GIA will not be granted, so we restrict it 100%.
So is that the same Malama Learning Center in Kapolei? It says Hui, Malama Learning Center. Because I know I'm familiar with, and I don't think that's a non-secular organization. I'm just concerned because it's a science community-based sustainability program, at least the Malama Learning Center, that works a lot directly with schools. And so seeing 100% of that restriction raises a little bit of concern to me.
Yeah, and it was based on AG review. I'd have to determine the specific location.
I think this might be a
It's
Maui
on
program.
Maui, yeah. I thought it was a neighbor island one, but,
Committee members, any other discussion? Lance, please.
Thanks for the presentation. I guess I'm still very concerned about the fact that your biggest cut is coming out from the weighted student formula. And one of your smaller cuts, or I guess your second biggest cut, would come maybe from EDN 200 and EDN 300. But I just don't see enough progress being made to cut the administrative areas in order to provide continued support for the weighted student formula. I just don't think this logically seems to make sense to me. I would ask you guys to look at this again. I think we need to understand this a little bit better. I'm not sure I understand the rationale behind cutting such a large amount, regardless of whether it's a reserve on the weighted student formula.
And just a historical look, the department does support EDN 100, and over the years there has been a substantial increase in what has happened in EDN 100 and the growth of the percentage of budget that EDN 100 has, whereas EDN 300 is actually below 2008 levels. EDN 200 is a little bit above where we were in 2008, but mostly due to the complex areas, establishment of the CASs and their authorities in managing our complex areas and the principals.
I guess this assumes that your current structure or your model on the administrative side remains intact. And I guess what I'm looking for is some way to reevaluate the current administrative model.
Thank you, Lance. Any other questions or comments? Tricia?
This is more to understand the COFA piece, because it looks like you dipped into COFA money in order to offset some of this restriction. And so what exactly was the COFA money supposed to be designated towards in the first place?
So the COFA money is it's a federal government tax replacement, if you will, because we're not getting tax money from the COFA immigrants. So it's sort of like impact aid, where we have flexible use of the funding. So we've selected to help it reduce our targeted restriction for this year.
So is the money supposed to also go towards supporting the educational needs of COFA immigrant students in our system, and then is that now then taken away in terms of that kind of resource?
No, so because it's a tax replacement, it's to benefit all students. So our tax dollars pay for all students. So this is just an offset for all students in education. So we're not restricting the services that we're providing to those students.
This is the Compact Impact Fund?
Yes.
So the federal government created this fund to mitigate the impacts that compact migrants have on the areas in the United States that they've designated where the majority of compact migrants are migrating to. And those are Hawaii, American Samoa, Guam, CNMI. And then they do a census-based survey to determine where these folks are. And there's an annual $30 million appropriation that is set in law that is then divided on an every 5-year review basis to those jurisdictions. So my understanding, having worked on this in the Resources Committee that crafted the law, is that it does go to the state of Hawaii to mitigate the impacts of compact migrants being allowed to come to the United States overall, not just to Hawaii, to pursue education, healthcare, and gainful work. So what the state does is then provide sort of an overall summary of where they feel that there's been an impact, and the Department of Education has always had a kind of analysis of how they feel, or maybe, less based on services, more based on numbers of students in our system from the compact states. So the money has also gone to healthcare organizations in our state in the past, and I I can't remember, I think the governor has the authority to help determine where those monies go.
Thank you, Amy, for that clarification. Are there any other questions, or if not, the chair will entertain a motion as appropriate.
I'm going to propose something, see if it flies. I move that we direct the department to remove the restriction, to remove weighted student formula from the restriction, and that it come back to the next FIC committee meeting. And if we need to have a special meeting, we can have a special meeting on this subject only, and propose a revised restriction that would not include weighted student formula.
Do I have a second?
I second.
Any discussion?
The thought would be that you would take a new look at this, including not funding positions that are not filled right now, or other measures. And perhaps we can use the PIG to have further discussions on this.
Okay, any further discussion or questions? If there are none, we will entertain the question on the motion on the floor. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion passes. So we'll take this up at our next Finance Committee meeting. Unless timing is such that we will require a special meeting, then we will make arrangements accordingly. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, last item, fairly easy one, I think. We have action on Board Policy 500.9, Establishment of Conflict Areas, and Board Policy 500.10, Functions of District Offices. You all have a submittal in your meeting materials describing the procedural background of these two policies. At its May 19, 2015 meeting, this committee took action asking that these two policies be amended in accordance with the department's recommendations. The submittal shows the changes the department is recommending to 500.9 and the recommendation that 500.10 be deleted. If there are any questions, we have Tammy Chun present from the Office of Strategy, Innovation, and Performance, or Amy Kuntz is also present. We have a second. Okay, any discussion? Okay, moved and seconded to adopt the Board Policy 500.9 as circulated. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Thank you. Do you have a second?
I second.
Okay, thank you. Moved and seconded to delete 500.10 from the board policy. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Great. There being no other agendized business, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Thank you very much. We will reconvene at 1:30.